Matthew Murdock, aka Daredevil, is a contradiction baked into another contradiction. During his day job as a lawyer, Matthew engages with and legitimizes the value of America's legal institutions, while at night he consistently defies American laws, dressing up as a vigilante and imposing his will onto Hell's Kitchen without a care in the world. It just seems so hypocritical that he works as a lawyer interpreting the law in a legal setting. However, the second he puts on the mask and becomes Daredevil, all of a sudden he is above the law. But this essence of contradiction is what makes him such a compelling and interesting character, because we are all hypocrites. We have all contradicted ourselves, and we have all fallen victim to selfish behaviors. And if we take a step back and psychoanalyze the patterns of Matthew Murdock, it speaks to a deeper truth about the political power structure of the world, and how through a postmodernist framework, Matthew's hypocrisy is both an act of resistance and complacency. An act of resistance and complacency that we also find ourselves engaging in too. So join me in this video as we dive in to Daredevil and the hypocrisy of postmodern existence. For this video, if we want to deconstruct Daredevil, we first must understand who he is. Matthew Murdock was born and raised in the predominantly Irish neighborhood Hell's Kitchen in New York City. Matthew was raised by a single father, Jack Murdock, a parent who, like most, wanted their kid to lead a better life than them. To provide for his child, Matthew's father was a boxer. It wasn't a life of luxury. Jack would often struggle to make ends meet, coming home beaten and bruised with only a few dollars to show for it. Jack and Matt's lives changed forever when a 9-year-old Matthew Murdock heroically saved a blind man from being hit by a truck. In the act of pushing the man to safety, Matt was struck by radioactive chemicals, leaving him blind but enhancing his remaining senses to extraordinary levels. Shortly after this accident, Matt's father would die after refusing to throw a boxing match. Jack knew he would be punished and maybe even killed by gangsters, but in Jack's mind, refusing to bend his knee to criminals was an act of pride, honor, and integrity. It was the morally right thing to do, an act that he hoped would help Matt understand the values of integrity and pride. As a young orphan boy, Matt found himself under the wing of a man named Stick. Stick is a member of an ancient ninja organization known as the Chaste. Much like Matt, Stick is blind but in possession of a heightened radar that allows him to hone his abilities as a powerful fighter. Stick trained Matt for a while, and during this time, he gave Matt the tools he needed to harness his powers and be the best warrior he could be. But eventually, Stick deemed Matt unworthy and too reckless and opted to abandon Matt in favor for a new protege. Wanting to use his heightened senses to spur change within the criminal justice system, Matt spent the next few years of his life going through school, where he ended up successfully passing the bar exam and becoming a criminal defense attorney in New York, starting a practice with his best friend, Foggy Nelson. During the day, Matthew Murdock uses his powers to get a better feel for the truth. His heightened hearing gives him the ability to easily detect when people are lying due to factors like an elevated heartbeat. With this knowledge, he's able to differentiate fact from fiction and build cases that are rooted in empirical truths. While at night, Matthew suits up as Daredevil, using his abilities to fight crime and combat the criminal impurities that tarnish his home of Hell's Kitchen. From a bird's-eye view, the path Matthew Murdock takes is a path forged out of an individualistic sense of obligation and duty. Matthew's father was killed by crime, so he takes justice into his own hands. As a lawyer, he works tirelessly to advocate for truth, justice, and equity. However, when traditional avenues of justice falter, Daredevil is always an easy substitute to make sure that punishment is administered the way he deems fit. It's a deeply complicated and contradictory relationship with the law, one that sees Matthew both fostering change within and outside of traditional institutions of law and order. All of this seems like a point of view that is unique to Matthew Murdock. It would take a very specific set of circumstances for someone to adopt the worldview and actions that Matthew adopts. But I'd argue Matthew Murdock's worldview is actually not so different from yours or mine. The majority of people living in this world are walking contradictions. Sure, Matthew Murdock's life was shaped by the socioeconomic plight of capitalism, the weight of disability, and the persistence of crime in a way that most of us would never truly understand. There is one thing that me, you, and Matthew Murdock are all influenced by equally, and that's power. So you're probably thinking, what the hell does power have to do with me and Daredevil? Well, to answer that question, we first have to understand what power is. The problem with this question is that in itself is a philosophical quandary that intellectuals have been pondering for centuries. The definition of power changes depending on who you ask. So, for the sake of this video, I'm going to use the postmodern framework established by French philosopher Michel Foucault to define what power is. If you're unfamiliar with Foucault, he's widely regarded as one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century. One of the core themes of Foucault's work was the examination of history to understand social phenomena, and using this knowledge to shed light on how things operate in the present. For example, in Discipline and Punish, Foucault analyzes the evolution of the prison system, contrasting the violent punishment methods of the 18th century with the more subtle disciplinary methods of the late 19th century. In the history of sexuality, Foucault breaks down how sexuality evolved from a non-labeled form of existence in the 17th century to a medicalized and categorized phenomenon in the late 19th century. In The Birth of the Clinic, Foucault examines the 18th century model of medicine and how it paved the way for the medical gaze, creating new forms of otherization within the field of science. Across all of these historical analyses, there's a clear through line. Foucault always seeks to understand the way in which power shapes our understanding of the world. So, what is power? Well, when you think of power, you might be thinking of top-down hierarchical structures. You might be thinking about lawmakers, governors, the president, or just the government or the state in general, and how their actions affect your ability to exist. And while it's true that these institutions wield power over us, a notion we'll dive deeper into later, Foucault argues that power and power relations exist both within and outside the realm of state authority. Power is not a tool wielded by just the ruling. Power is an oceanic force that seeps into our everyday life. Power permeates as an immanent entity within the fabric of social structures. Power flows vertically in the sense it influences hierarchical structures, and horizontally in the sense that it shapes and guides the realities of the more mundane aspects of life. Think about school. You can witness vertical power by looking at positions of authority. You have the student, the teacher, the principal, the school board, etc. Every one of these actors, starting from the teacher, exercises authority over another person. These authority figures set and enforce the rules. They monitor each other, track performance, and enact forms of discipline when necessary. That's the traditional top-down power structure we think of when we normally seek to understand how power operates. However, Foucault posits that there's another element of power at play too. Think about the relationships between students, the values that are instilled into these students by their peers. The way these students dress is based off of trends they see other students participate in. The way these students act is based on the way they see other students act. And the slang these students use is based off the slang they see other students use. It's a symbiotic relationship where power is transferred from student to student. But this is a type of power that is not inherently oppressive, but it is intrinsically relational. This viewpoint gives us a radically new way to interrogate what power truly is. Rather than viewing it as a thing that people possess, it's instead observed as a constant force in the everyday aspect of life. When we use this framework to look at Daredevil, we see how power pushes and pulls his life in different directions. If power is an ever-present force enacted through socialization, then we can look at key moments in his life which we discussed earlier and see the power relation dynamic in play. For example, the relationship between Daredevil and his father is emblematic of a traditional paternal power structure. The father influences the child through his actions and instilling of values. But Jack's history as a boxer undoubtedly shapes the way Matt views violence and morals in a way that is very unique. As a boxer, Jack uses violence as a tool to achieve his goals. While society often condemns violence in a quote-unquote civilized world, Jack's profession demonstrates to Matt that in the right context, violence isn't inherently wrong. It can be controlled, strategic, and even necessary. In the ring, Jack both delivers and endures brutal beatings. Every match leaves both fighters with bruises, cuts, and pain, yet they walk away with more than just wounds. They gain a sense of accomplishment and the material reward that comes with victory. It's a paradoxical worldview, the idea that you can inflict harm yet still uphold a sense of honor and decency. But within the dynamic between Jack and Matt, it makes a certain kind of sense. It shapes the way Matt will come to see strength, justice, and the morality of power. And then you look at the reason why Matt Murdock was murdered. He refused to submit to corruption by rigging a fight. This underscores underscores the principle that even within the realm of controlled violence, justice must remain a guiding force for one's moral compass. In essence, the power dynamic between Jack and Matt shapes Matt's worldview. It instills in him a complex understanding of violence, acknowledging both its harms and its utility when wielded with discipline and purpose. Then we jump forward and meet Stick, an ancient ninja who acts as a mentor for Matt. We see how power operates in the relationship between teacher and student. Stick gives Matthew the knowledge he needs to harness his heightened senses and operate as a tool for violence. Using the normative understanding Matthew had of violence based off his father's experience, Stick provides Matt, a boy who thought his disability would leave him far removed from violence, the ability to become a truly unruly weapon. Once again, power flows not from some top-down hierarchical structure, but instead as a constant guiding force between mentor and student. However, when you take a deeper peek into Matt's adult life, there are some really interesting points of analysis to be made about the power relation between Matt Murdock and institutions of power, like law and order, that shape him and the world around him. As Matthew Murdock, Daredevil operates as a defense attorney, navigating the legal system to advocate for those who are often denied fair and equitable treatment. Within the framework of juridical power, he disrupts the state's authority, challenging its ability to discipline through incarceration, defending the rights of the accused, and exposing the flaws in the criminal justice system. If power is fluid and can shift under the right conditions, then Matthew Murdock exemplifies how resisting state power can alter power dynamics in favor of the marginalized. However, the paradox of being a lawyer is one that simultaneously resists state power while also always operating within the disciplinary structures of law and order. In this way, Matthew is a part of the same network of power he aims to resist. This is what Foucault would call a strategic reversal of power relations rather than an outright rejection of power itself, leveraging the system against itself to achieve justice. This dynamic in itself is a fascinating contradiction within juridical power. Even when directly resisting oppression through legal advocacy, simply operating within the framework of legal institutions reinforces those legal institutions' authority. By adhering to, observing to, and interpreting the law, one legitimizes it and acknowledges that it is a viable mechanism for discipline and punishment, even in instances where you challenge injustices and win. The praxis of a defense attorney is one of both resistance and complacency. But then you add Daredevil into the mix and it becomes a lot more interesting. To understand why this is the case, we need to shift the focus back to Foucault briefly. There is an idea Foucault explores in his work called biopower. Think of biopower as what happens when different avenues of power are crystallized and used to manage and control large bodies of people. Simply put, biopower is having power over bodies. The thing about biopower though is that it's not as explicit as you might expect. Biopower's utility can be understood in a way which higher forces such as the state utilize power to optimize and control large swaths of people. It is a form of control that aims to not just influence, but understand, control, discipline, and predict the actions of individuals. Think about the modern legal system. When following laws, there's always the direct threat of punishment. If you break a law, you can be disciplined via imprisonment or in some cases given the death penalty. This enforcement of power is what we would call sovereign power, a power that impacts bodies directly through immediate measures. However, biopower is a force that actively shapes our behaviors and attitudes towards the law. Living in the 21st century, we are in a surveillance state. Law enforcement agencies can subpoena access to our personal devices and see what we have been looking at on our phones if they really want to. So oftentimes we'll be careful to text something to people that might be deemed incriminating. When you're walking around a store and you see a sign that says "Smile, you're on camera," you might find yourself making sure you look as polite and auspicious as possible. Even if you have no intention of stealing something, you don't want a camera to record you looking sketchy. You don't know if someone's watching you on camera. You don't know if the camera's even turned on. But most of the time, you'll find yourself acting as if you are being watched. We're often conditioned to be careful with what we say online and on social media as well, because you never know if employers or even law enforcement agencies will find a post you made online and use that against you. For example, a lot of people would be cautious to make jokes that incite violence or harm on the internet. Even when you're not committing a crime or have no intention of committing a crime, you act accordingly on social media because you never know if what you say can come back to haunt you. That is biopower, a self-regulated, internalized discipline that subtly coerces us into shaping our behavior in ways that ultimately serve institutional interests. We don't act this way because of direct force or explicit commands. No, we act this way because power is embedded in surveillance and operates as a form of biopolitical control, conditioning us to behave as if we are being watched, even in the absence of an authority figure. Going back to Daredevil, and we can see a striking parallel to Foucault's concept of biopower. Despite not being an institutional authority, Daredevil functions as a biopolitical force, particularly in the way he embodies the surveillance aspects of biopower. Criminals in Hell's Kitchen fear Daredevil. They don't know when he's going to emerge from the shadows to deliver a beating. They don't know if they're being watched or followed or listened to. And because of that uncertainty, they adjust their behaviors as if they are under constant surveillance. Unlike law enforcement, Daredevil doesn't need a subpoena or a court order to stop and seize someone. He acts on his own terms, outside of the law. And that's what makes him so effective. The mere idea that Daredevil might be watching is enough to make criminals self-regulate, just as biopower conditions people to police themselves under the invisible eye of authority. Foucault would liken this interpretation of surveillance to an idea called the Panopticon. The Panopticon is an 18th century prison design that features a central watchtower overlooking every prisoner. The key to its power lies in its uncertainty. Inmates never know if they're being watched at any given moment. As a result, they behave as if they are under constant surveillance, ensuring their own compliance without the need for constant enforcement. Even if the tower is empty, its mere presence is enough to instill self-regulation. This is a form of biopolitical control, using the threat of surveillance rather than direct force to shape behavior. The fear of observation and punishment replaces the need for constant intervention, making discipline function invisibly yet effectively. And that's exactly what Daredevil represents. He doesn't need to patrol every street corner 24/7. His presence alone is enough to influence behavior. Criminals don't know if he's watching, listening, or lurking in the shadows, but they act as if he is. The devil of Hell's Kitchen, like the Panopticon, doesn't need to be seen to exert control. The fear of him is enough. And that, in a very simple way, is how Daredevil as a character embodies the core tenets of Foucault's postmodern teachings. Daredevil's entire existence is shaped by power. The fluidity of power pushes and pulls his life in different directions. Whether it's the direct, non-hierarchical power relations between him and the people of Hell's Kitchen, the juridical power he both disrupts and reinforces as a lawyer, or the biopolitical mechanisms he employs to subtly control the criminal population, Daredevil is defined by power and power relations. His war on crime is not about fighting evil. In a lot of ways, it's about the way he regulates the behavior of those around him, enforcing an order of his own making while simultaneously rejecting institutional authority. And while Daredevil's circumstances may seem unique, this struggle of power applies to all of us. As individuals, we are constantly shaped by the power of our families, friends, peers, and loved ones. The values we inherit define us, shape our worldviews, and dictate our behavior in ways we rarely question. Larger institutionalized power further confines us, often under the illusion of freedom. We believe we act independently, yet we are continuously influenced by societal norms, legal structures, and economic systems that dictate the boundaries of our lives. Even as we work to resist these structures to carve out spaces of autonomy and sites of resistance, we also inevitably normalize and reinforce the very institutions we seek to escape. Take something as simple as choosing to shop from ethical brands instead of major corporations. While this decision may seem like an act of resistance against exploitative labor and environmental harm, it still operates within the larger framework of consumer capitalism. Rather than challenging the system itself, it reinforces the idea that ethical consumption is an individual responsibility, shifting focus away from systemic change and allowing corporations to maintain power by marketing themselves as quote-unquote better alternatives. The very act of resisting unethical business practices through consumer choice ends up legitimizing the power of the market rather than questioning its structure. And that is in a lot of ways what Daredevil does as a lawyer too. He doesn't question the structure and inequalities of the legal justice system. He simply embraces it as a normative truth and works to reform it from within. The paradox of fighting power while simultaneously living with and legitimizing the grasp of power is what makes Daredevil such a compelling figure and what makes Foucault's ideas so deeply relevant to our own lives. And that's only the tip of the iceberg. There are countless other ways Foucault's theories can deepen our understanding of Daredevil. For instance, Foucault's concept of the medical gaze and the way society objectifies others based on how their bodies are perceived directly relates to Matt Murdock's disability. His blindness becomes a lens through which society marginalizes him, projecting a narrow, often inaccurate understanding of his abilities and limitations. Additionally, Matt's Catholic guilt can be explored through the lens of biopolitical control, driving him to conform to puritanical moral standards. However, despite his adherence to these ideals, he consistently challenges and disrupts the very norms he's bound to regularly by engaging in actions that the church would deem sinful. Foucault's history of sexuality also offers valuable insights into how Matt's sexual identity is shaped by both external societal pressures and personal choices, revealing the complex relationship between power, desire, and identity. But those are ideas for another time. Maybe I'll touch on it in another video. If y'all want me to, let me know down below. As always, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.